The wind in Dry Creek did not simply blow, it scoured. It came down from the northern peaks of the Montana Territory, sweeping across the Wyoming border like a tangible thing, carrying the grit of 1,000 miles of empty sagebrush and hardpan. It found every crack in the warped siding of the buildings that lined Main Street, whistling through keyholes and rattling window panes until the glass hummed in its frames. It was late autumn in the year 1884, and the sky above the high plains was a bruised purple, heavy with the promise of a winter that would show no mercy. The mountains to the west were already capped in white, standing like jagged teeth against the horizon, distant and indifferent to the small, dusty settlement huddled at their feet. Ada Lee woke to the sound of that wind. It was the only alarm she had ever known. She lay still for a moment in the narrow, iron bed, pulling the thin wool blanket up to her chin, watching her breath plume in the frigid air of the room. She lived in the loft space above Miller's livery and feed, a room that smelled perpetually of cured hay, horse liniment, and the ammonia tang of manure from the stalls below. It was not a place for a lady, the townspeople said. But then, Dry Creek had decided long ago that Ada Lee was not a lady. She threw back the covers, shivering as her bare feet hit the rough plank floor. There was no time to linger. The sun was barely a gray smear in the east, and Mrs. Gable at the boarding house would expect the laundry sorted by 7 o'clock. Ada dressed quickly in the dim light, pulling on heavy wool stockings that she had darned so many times they were more thread than original fabric. Over her shift, she fastened her dress. It was a calico print, once a bright pattern of small blue flowers, now faded to the color of dishwater and worn thin at the elbows and knees. It was clean, though. Ada made sure of that. No matter how tired she was, no matter how much the lye soap cracked her skin until it bled, she kept that dress clean. Dirt was a luxury she could not afford. Dirt was an admission of defeat. She grabbed the tin bucket from the table and went down the rickety back stairs. The morning air hit her face like a slap, sharp and biting. At the communal pump behind the livery, the handle was coated in a rim of frost. Ada gripped the iron, feeling it burn her palm, and began to pump. It took 12 hard strokes before the water gurgled up, spitting ice shards into her bucket. Her hands, red and chapped, ached with a deep, throbbing rhythm that never quite went away, even in sleep. As she hauled the water back up the stairs, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the darkened window of the general store across the alley. A pale, thin face looked back at her. Her hair, the color of dried wheat, was pulled back severely to keep it out of her eyes while she worked. She looked older than her 22 years. There was a hardness around her mouth, a set to her jaw that hadn't been there 5 years ago. She looked away quickly. She hated mirrors. They showed her a ghost, a woman fading into the background of a town that wished she would simply disappear. Dry Creek tolerated her because she was useful. She mended the silk bodices of the banker's wife and scrubbed the stained trousers of the saloon keeper. She was the invisible hands that kept the town presenting a respectable face, even as she was denied any respect herself. Later that morning, as she walked down the boardwalk to deliver a bundle of mended shirts, she felt the eyes on her. It was a physical sensation, like a prickling on the back of her neck. 2 women stood outside the millinery, their heads bent close together. As Ada passed, their conversation halted abruptly. They watched her, their gazes sliding over her worn dress, her boots with the scuffed toes. "Did you hear?" one whispered, loud enough for Ada to catch. "She is still wearing that same rag. Whatever her father left her must be gone by now," the other replied, a quiet snicker following the words. Ada kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, her spine stiff. She did not hurry. To hurry would be to show them they had landed a blow, but inside, the shame burned hot and acidic in her chest. It was not just the poverty. Poverty was common enough out here. It was the memory that hung over her, more suffocating than the dust. She could not walk past the large cottonwood tree at the edge of town without seeing it. The shadow of her father, his hands bound, swinging in the breeze while the good people of Dry Creek stood and watched. Rustler. They had called him thief. He had pleaded his innocence until the rope cut off his breath, But Silas Brand had spoken, and Silas Brand owned the valley. The shame of being the hangman's daughter was a stain that no amount of lye soap could scrub away. The children knew it too. They would stop their games when she passed, staring with wide, curious eyes, repeating the ugly names they heard at the dinner table. Rustler's girl. Trash. It was just past noon when the rhythm of the street changed. A group of horses came trotting down the main thoroughfare, kicking up clouds of tan dust. There were 8 of them, a small remuda of sturdy, range-ready mounts, herded by a single rider. Ada was at the pump again, filling a kettle for the laundress, when the rider slowed his horse nearby to let a freight wagon pass. He was a man who looked as if the land had carved him out of oak and leather. He sat deep and easy in the saddle, his body swaying in perfect time with the animal beneath him. He wore a canvas coat that had seen years of rain and sun, and his hat was pulled low, shadowing his face. But as he pulled back on the reins, he glanced toward the pump. For a second, the world narrowed. Ada looked up, wiping a stray lock of hair from her forehead with a wet hand. The cowboy looked down. His eyes were dark, set in a face bronzed by the high-altitude sun. There was a faint, white line of a scar running across his left wrist, visible where his glove ended. He didn't sneer. He didn't look through her as if she were a post, nor did he look at her with the leering, hungry appraisal she often got from the drifters at the saloon. He just looked. It was a level, acknowledging gaze, brief and heavy. Then he touched the brim of his hat, a microscopic gesture, and clucked to his horse, moving the herd toward the livery corral. Ada stood frozen, the heavy bucket pulling at her shoulder. Her heart gave a single, strange thump against her ribs. It had been years since a man had looked at her without contempt or expectation. Caleb Hart settled his horses at the livery with the efficiency of a man who preferred animals to people. He checked their hooves, spoke to them in a low rumble, and paid the livery boy in silver coin. He was new to Dry Creek, but he had seen a dozen towns just like it from Texas to the Dakotas. They all smelled the same: dust, ambition, and old sweat. He walked toward the saloon, his gait stiff from weeks in the saddle. He carried his history in the way he moved, careful, deliberate, checking the corners of a room before he fully entered. Inside the dim interior of the Lucky Ace, he ordered a whiskey. When the barkeep slammed the bottle down on the counter, the glass clinking sharply against the wood, Caleb flinched. It was a subtle thing, a tightening of the muscles in his neck, a blink that lasted a fraction of a second too long, but it was there. He gripped the bar rail, breathing out slowly. He poured one shot. He drank it neat, the burn welcome in his throat. When the man next to him offered to buy a round, Caleb shook his head. "One is enough," he said. His voice was gravel, unused to long sentences. He was done with the trail for a while. The accident at the crossing on the Red River 3 months ago still played behind his eyelids whenever he tried to sleep, the water churning, the boy shouting, the rope snapping. He had come north to find quiet, to buy a small patch of ground where he didn't have to be responsible for anyone's life but his own. He looked into the amber liquid in his glass and saw the reflection of a man who was tired of running. The town was buzzing with a different kind of energy that afternoon. The harvest social was tonight at the church hall. It was the biggest event of the season, a time when the harshness of frontier life was briefly suspended for fiddle music and apple pie. Ada had been hired to help with the decorations. She spent 3 hours standing on a ladder, hanging streamers of colored paper and arranging dried corn stalks in the corners of the hall. The other women, the wives of merchants and ranchers, bustled around her. They spoke over her head and around her body as if she were part of the furniture. "I do hope the music is better than last year, Mrs." Miller said, smoothing her apron. "And the food," added another woman. "I heard the Brands are bringing a side of beef." Ada worked silently. She knew she wasn't really invited, not as a guest. She was hired help. But as the afternoon waned and the hall began to transform into something warm and welcoming, a small, stubborn seed of longing took root in her chest. She wanted to hear the music. She wanted to taste the cider. She wanted, just for one night, to be part of the town instead of its outcast. She returned to her room as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and blood red. She lit the kerosene lamp and looked at her dress. It was the only one she had, the calico. She took it off and laid it on the bed. She heated the heavy flat iron on the small wood stove in the corner. Carefully, reverently, she pressed the fabric. She smoothed out the wrinkles in the skirt, trying to coax some life back into the limp cotton. She found a tear near the hem and sat by the window, squinting in the fading light to mend it with tiny, invisible stitches. "You are a fool, Ada Lee," she whispered to the empty room, but she washed her face until it shone. She took the ribbon from her hair and retied it, trying to make it look festive. She felt foolish, yes, but she also felt a quiet, terrifying hope. She did not want to be alone tonight. When she walked to the church hall, the night was cold enough to freeze breath in the throat. The windows of the hall glowed with a yellow lamplight, spilling squares of warmth onto the frozen mud of the street. She could hear the fiddle already, a lively jig that made her steps falter. She opened the heavy oak door and slipped inside. The heat hit her first, a thick, humid wall smelling of beef stew, wood smoke, damp wool, and too many bodies in a small space. The noise was deafening. Boots stomped on the plank floor. Laughter rang out, and the fiddle screeched in joy. Ada stood near the door, clutching her shawl tight around her shoulders. For a moment, no one noticed her. Then, Mrs. Gable turned from the punch bowl. Her smile vanished. She nudged the woman next to her. The ripple of silence spread outward from the door. It wasn't total silence, but the conversations near her died out, replaced by a brittle, uncomfortable quiet. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. Ada felt the blood drain from her face. She had made a mistake. She should have stayed in her room. A group of teenage girls and young married women stood near the center of the room. They were dressed in their best, taffeta and bright wool, ribbons in their hair. They looked at Ada's faded calico, clean and pressed though it was, and the whispers started. "Look at the hem." One girl giggled behind her hand. "You can see where she patched it. It looks like something she pulled out of the rag bag." Another replied, "Saloon trash cloth." A third girl whispered, her eyes dancing with cruel amusement. Ada stood her ground, though her knees shook. She fixed her eyes on a point on the far wall, trying to make herself stone. She had practiced this. She had practiced being numb. But tonight, with the music and the warmth she was excluded from, the armor was thin. Caleb Hart was standing near the punch bowl, a cup of cider untouched in his hand. He had been watching the room with a detached curiosity, feeling out of place in his trail clothes. Though he had brushed them clean, he saw the girl come in. He recognized her from the pump. He saw the way she hesitated, the way her hands gripped her elbows as if she were holding herself together. He watched the room react to her. He saw the shift in the atmosphere, the way the town turned its back and bared its teeth at the same time. He saw the women snicker. He saw the men look at her, then look away, shuffling their feet, complicit in their silence. One of the girls, emboldened by the laughter of her friends, raised her voice. She was the daughter of the general store owner, wearing a blue silk dress that probably cost more than Ada earned in a year. "Hey, Ada," the girl called out. The music lulled, making her voice carry to every corner of the room. "If you wanted a new dress so bad, I'm sure there are men here who would let you earn it. You know, the way your kind always does." The shock in the room was palpable. A few men coughed and looked at the floor. The women gasped, half in scandal, half in delight. Laughter bubbled up, harsh and jagged. Ada felt as if she had been struck. The room spun. The cruelty was so naked, so precise. She couldn't breathe. Her hands curled into the fabric of her skirt, crushing the carefully ironed pleats. She wanted to run, but her feet were nailed to the floor. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and humiliating. Then, a shadow fell over her. Caleb Hart stepped away from the wall. He moved with a deceptive slowness, his boots thudding heavy on the floorboards. He walked straight into the center of the circle, placing himself between Ada and the group of girls. He was tall, his shoulders broad enough to block out the view of the jeering crowd. He looked at the girl in the blue silk. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were hard as flint. "Apologize," he said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the murmurs like a knife. The girl blinked, her smile faltering. "Excuse me?" "I said apologize," Caleb repeated. "To the lady." The girl scoffed, looking around at her friends for support. She drew herself up, tossing her curls. "I will do no such thing. Nobody cares what a drifter trailhand thinks. It is just Ada. Everyone knows what she is." Caleb did not blink. He did not look at the men who were starting to bristle at his tone. He turned his head slowly, sweeping his gaze across the faces of the townspeople. The banker, the store owner, the mothers, the fathers. He looked at them until they shifted uncomfortably. Then he looked back at the girl, and his voice carried to the rafters. "You are wrong," he said. He turned slightly, looking at Ada. She was trembling, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. He saw the patches on her dress, the red, cracked skin of her hands, the dignity she was fighting to keep from shattering. He looked back at the room. She is the finest woman here. The silence that fell this time was absolute. It was heavy, stunned. A few people scoffed, a sharp expulsion of breath, but no one spoke. The banker opened his mouth and closed it. The girl in the blue silk turned a deep, blotchy red. Ada felt a flush rise from her neck to her hairline. It was humiliation, yes, but beneath it was something else, a strange, burning warmth. She looked up at him. He was not looking at the crowd anymore. He was looking at her. His expression was serious, devoid of mockery. She wanted to flee, she wanted to vanish, but she also wanted, desperately, to believe him. The preacher, sensing the volatility of the moment, cleared his throat loudly. He signaled the fiddler. "Music, please! Let us have music!" The fiddle scratched out a tentative note, then launched into a waltz, though the rhythm was a little too fast, a little frantic. Caleb did not move away. He turned fully toward Ada. He saw the flight instinct in her eyes. He knew if he let her go now, she would run out that door and never come back. "May I have this dance?" he asked. He held out his hand. His palm was calloused, scarred, and steady. He did not demand, he waited. Ada stared at his hand. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every eye in the room was boring into her back. To dance was madness. To dance was to accept this insane declaration. But the alternative was to walk out into the cold alone. Slowly, terrifyingly. She lifted her hand. She placed her rough, work-worn fingers into his. Caleb closed his hand around hers. His grip was warm and solid. He stepped in, placing his other hand lightly on her waist. They began to move. It was a simple, choppy waltz. Ada was stiff, her movements wooden. She was painfully aware of her ragged dress swirling around her boots, of her cracked hands resting on the fine wool of his coat. She kept her head down, unable to meet the gazes of the people they passed. Caleb ignored them all. He steered her carefully through the crowd, his body shielding her. "Look at me," he murmured. Ada looked up. His eyes were crinkled at the corners. "Do not mind them," he said quietly. "They are just noise. Focus on the music. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. His voice was a low rumble in his chest. It grounded her. He spoke of small things as they turned, the uneven floorboards, the heat of the stove, the way the fiddler tapped his foot. He did not speak of the insult. He did not speak of her father. He simply held her as if she were made of something precious, something that deserved to be held. For a few minutes, the town of Dry Creek faded. There was only the scrape of boots, the wheeze of the accordion that had joined the fiddle, and the heat of his hand on her back. When the music stopped, the spell broke. The whispers rose instantly, like a hiss of steam. Ada pulled back, breathless. The reality of what had just happened crashed down on her. She had danced with a stranger. She had been the center of a spectacle. "I have to go," she whispered. She pulled her hand from his and turned, weaving through the crowd. Her head ducked. She grabbed her shawl and pushed through the heavy oak doors, bursting out into the freezing night air. She leaned against the rough wood of the church wall, gasping for breath. The wind dried the sweat on her face instantly. She was shaking, but as she wrapped her arms around herself and began the long walk back to the livery, she realized something. The cold did not bite as deep as it usually did. The image of the girl's sneering face was fading, replaced by the memory of a rough voice saying 5 words that echoed in the empty street. "She is the finest woman here." She touched the spot on her waist where his hand had rested. It still felt warm. It was a dangerous warmth. She knew. It was a hope that could kill her if she let it. But as she walked under the vast, star-dusted sky, Ada Lee did not feel quite so invisible. The sun had not yet burned the frost from the sagebrush when the talk began. In Dry Creek, gossip moved faster than the wind and cut deeper than the cold. The previous night's dance, the single act of a cowboy stepping across a floor to claim a shunned woman, had been twisted by morning into something unrecognizable. The town did not know how to handle a moment of grace, so they turned it into a scandal. By the time the Mercantile opened its doors, the story was that Caleb Hart had bought Ada Lee's favor with a dance, or that she had bewitched him, or that they had been carrying on in secret long before the music started. Ada heard the murmurs as she stood behind the boarding house. Her arms plunged elbow-deep in a vat of boiling water and lye. The steam rose in thick, choking clouds, curling around her face, but it could not dampen the voices drifting from the open kitchen window above her. It was bold. I will give her that. "Mrs." Gable's voice floated down. "Sharp and tinny. To stand there in that rag and let him handle her like that?" "And him," another voice chimed in. "A drifter. They are probably 2 of a kind. I saw the way he looked at her. There was no Christian charity in that look." Ada scrubbed a shirt against the washboard with a violence that threatened to tear the fabric. Rage, hot and sudden, flared in her chest. She wanted to scream at the window. She wanted to march up there and tell them that for one moment, she had felt human, and they had no right to dirty it. But the rage was quickly swamped by a familiar, heavy shame. She wished he hadn't spoken. She wished he had left her to the mockery. It was easier to be invisible than to be the center of this sordid speculation. Yet, as she wrung out the heavy wool, twisting it until her knuckles turned white, his voice echoed in her mind, stubborn and clear. "She is the finest woman here." She hated that she replayed it. She hated that it made her pause, water dripping from her wrists to the frozen mud, and stare at the gray horizon with a foolish ache in her throat. Across town, Caleb Hart was learning the cost of his gallantry. He was in the livery stable, pitching hay into the stalls for his small string of horses. The air was thick with dust and the smell of animals. 2 local ranch hands were leaning against the tack room door, watching him. They were men Caleb had seen drinking the night before, men who held their liquor poorly and their tongues even worse. "Quite a show last night. Hart," one of them said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the straw. "Do not think I have ever seen a man waste that much effort on hangman's spawn." The other man laughed. A low, ugly sound. "Maybe he likes them desperate. They say the desperate ones are grateful." Caleb did not stop working. He drove the pitchfork into the bale, the muscles of his back bunching under his shirt. His jaw was clamped so tight his teeth ached. His hands remained steady on the smooth wood of the handle. But inside, a dark current churned. He knew these men. He knew the type. They were small men who felt big only when they were standing on someone else's neck. But their words dug in. They pricked at his own insecurities, his fear that he was a fool who rushed in where he didn't belong. He had spent a lifetime trying to protect people, his younger brother, his trail partner, and he had buried them all. Was he just making things worse for the girl? He turned slowly, resting the pitchfork on the ground. He looked at the men with eyes that were flat and unamused. "If you have something to say it to me," Caleb said. His voice was low, barely over the sound of the horses chewing. "But keep her name out of your mouth." The men shifted. The laughter died. They had seen the scar on his wrist and the way he wore his gun. low and tied down. They muttered something about a joke and shuffled off into the daylight. Caleb watched them go, letting out a breath he didn't know he had been holding. He felt exposed. He had painted a target on his back, and worse, on hers. Later that morning, the sky turned a hard, slate gray, promising snow that wouldn't fall. Ada needed thread. It was a simple necessity, but walking to the general store felt like running a gauntlet. She kept her head down, her shawl pulled tight, ignoring the heads that turned as she passed. The store smelled of coffee beans, leather, and spices, a rich, warm scent that always made her stomach rumble. She moved quickly to the dry goods counter, hoping to buy her spool and leave before anyone spoke to her. Well, if it isn't the belle of the ball. The voice was smooth, cultured, and cold as the bottom of a well. Ada froze. She knew that voice. Everyone in the valley knew it. Silas Brand stood near the stove, warming his gloved hands. He was a handsome man in a predatory way, dressed in a suit of dark wool that fit him perfectly. His silver hair was combed back, and his eyes, the color of frozen water, fixed on Ada with an amusement that made her skin crawl. He owned the bank, the largest ranch, and effectively, the town. He was the man who had insisted her father be made an example of. Ada gripped the counter. "Mr. Brand," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Silas walked over to her. He moved with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. He stopped too close, invading her space, smelling of expensive bay rum and cigars. "You surprised us all last night." "Ada," Silas said, "I did not know you had it in you to capture a stranger's eye, though I suppose a drifter will take what he can get." He reached out and touched her arm. It was a light touch, his gloved fingers brushing the sleeve of her faded dress, but it felt like a brand. Ada flinched, pulling back, but the counter trapped her. "If you are tired of scraps." "Ada," Silas said, lowering his voice so only she could hear, "if you are tired of patching rags, you know I can take care of you. I have always said you were too pretty to be a washerwoman." The implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating. He wasn't offering kindness. He was offering to buy her, just as he bought cattle and land. Ada opened her mouth to speak, but fear choked her. This was the man who had killed her father. He could snap his fingers and she would be out of her room, out of work, starving on the plain. We are all out of that particular thread. A voice cut in from the doorway. Silas turned, his smile thinning but not disappearing. Caleb Hart stood in the entrance of the aisle. He filled the space, his canvas coat dusty, his hat shadowing his eyes. He wasn't looking at Silas. He was looking at the shelves, feigning interest in a row of canned peaches, but his body was coiled tight. "Excuse me," Silas said. Caleb looked at him then. "I said, it looks like you are blocking the lady's way, and I need to get to the counter." Silas laughed softly. It was a dry, rattling sound. "Ah, the White Knight returns. Mr. Hart, is it? I believe you have made quite an impression on our little town." "I am just here for supplies," Caleb said. He stepped forward, moving smoothly between Ada and Silas. He did not shove the banker, but he occupied the space with such finality that Silas was forced to take a step back. Silas looked from Caleb to Ada, his eyes narrowing. A dangerous light flickered there. He adjusted his cuffs, his smile turning sharp. "Of course," he said, "supplies. A man needs to be prepared if he plans to stay, though winters here are hard on strangers. Very hard." He tipped his hat to Ada, a mockery of a gesture, and walked out. The bell above the door jingled cheerfully, a stark contrast to the tension he left behind. Ada let out a shuddering breath, her knees nearly giving way. Caleb turned to her. He didn't touch her. He stayed a respectful distance away, but his eyes searched her face. "Are you all right?" he asked. Ada nodded, though she was shaking. She bought her thread with fumbling fingers and fled the store, unable to look at him. He found her an hour later. She was behind the livery stable, hanging sheets on the line. The wind had picked up, snapping the wet fabric like whips. The sky was vast and indifferent. geese honking high above as they fled south away from the coming freeze. "Ada," Caleb called out. She turned, her hair whipping across her face. She looked fierce and small against the gray landscape. "What do you want?" she asked. Her voice was brittle. Caleb took off his hat, holding it in his hands. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight. "I wanted to apologize." "Apologize?" Ada squinted at him. "For last night," he said, "and for today. It seems my speaking up has only made the wasps buzz louder. I did not intend to make your life harder." Ada grabbed a wet sheet from the basket and threw it over the line. "Harder?" she snapped. "Do you think it matters? They always talk. You just gave them a new tune to hum." She pinned the sheet furiously. "Do not look at me like that," she said, her voice trembling. "Like what? Like you pity me? Like I am some wounded bird you need to mend to show everyone what a good man you are? I do not need your pity. Caleb Hart, I have survived this long without it." Caleb stepped closer. He reached out to help her with a corner of the sheet that was flapping wild in the wind. His hand brushed hers. The contact was electric, shocking in the cold air. They both froze. For a second, the wind seemed to stop. Ada looked at his hand, large, scarred, capable, resting near her red, chapped fingers. "I do not pity you," Caleb said quietly, "and I do not care about showing off." Ada looked up at him. His eyes were dark and steady, stripped of all pretense. "Then why?" she whispered. "Why did you say it?" "Because it was true," he said. Ada felt the fight drain out of her. She slumped slightly, the sheet billowing between them. "No one has said a kind word to me in 4 years." She admitted, her voice catching. "It scared me." Caleb pinned the sheet. He looked out at the horizon, where the mountains were swallowing the afternoon light. "I have a place," he said suddenly. He kept his eyes on the distance, a homestead, about 15 miles north, near the creek. "It is rough. The cabin needs work. The roof leaks, and the fences are down. I'm trying to get it set for winter before the snows hit deep." Ada watched him, wary. "I need help." Caleb continued, "I can handle the stock, but I cannot mend curtains or cook a decent meal to save my life. I need someone to help me put the house in order." He turned back to her. "I'm offering a job. Ada, wages, $2 a week and board. You would have your own room. I would sleep in the barn if the cabin is too small, or I will partition it off. It is strictly work." Ada stared at him. The offer hung between them. To leave town, to leave the whispers and the eyes. But to go with a man, a stranger. "And what will people say then?" she asked. "Let them say what they want," Caleb said. "They are already saying it, at least out there. You would not have to hear it." He put his hat back on. "Think about it. I am heading out in 2 days. That night, the wind howled around the eaves of the livery. Ada lay in her bed, staring at the dark ceiling. The cold seeped through the thin walls. She weighed her life in the dark. If she stayed, she knew her future. More washing, more mending, and Silas Brand. She had seen the look in his eyes today. He was losing patience. He would corner her again, and next time, Caleb might not be there. The town would let him do it. They would look the other way, saying she was just a rustler's daughter and it was all she could expect. If she went. She thought of Caleb's hand on her waist during the waltz. It had been firm, but respectful. He hadn't tried to pull her closer than was decent. She thought of his eyes when he told the girl to apologize. There was a stillness in him that drew her, a quiet that felt like shelter. But men were dangerous. Her father had been a good man, and the world had killed him. Could she trust Caleb? Or was he just another trap in a different shape? A mile away, in the bunkhouse of the livery, Caleb lay with his hands behind his head, unable to sleep. He listened to the breathing of the other men in the room, but his mind was back on the Red River. He closed his eyes and saw the water, brown, churning, violent. He saw the boy, barely 18, his horse losing its footing. Caleb had been there. He had been close enough to throw a rope, but he had hesitated, just for a second, checking his own saddle, checking his own safety. And in that second, the current had taken the boy. Guilt sat on his chest like a stone. He had come north to outrun it, but you cannot outrun what lives in your own head. Was he trying to save Ada to make up for the boy? Was he using her to scrub his own conscience clean? He didn't know. He only knew that when he saw her standing there, proud and ragged in the face of that crowd, he felt a kinship he hadn't expected. She was surviving. He respected that. The next day, the decision was made for her. Ada was walking behind the church, taking a shortcut to the pump, when Silas Brand stepped out from behind the woodshed. He didn't smile this time. "You are avoiding me, Ada," he said. "I have work to do." "Mr. Brand," she said, trying to step around him. He moved to block her, backing her against the rough clapboard wall of the church. He didn't touch her, but he leaned in, planting a hand on the wall beside her head. "I am not a man who likes to wait," he said softly. "I made you an offer, a generous one. You think this cowboy is going to save you? He is a drifter. He will be gone with the first snow, and you will still be here, and I will still be the man who decides who eats in this town." Ada felt panic coil in her stomach, cold and sharp. She could smell the tobacco on his breath. "I would rather starve," she hissed, her voice shaking but defiant. "I would rather freeze to death than owe you anything." Silas's face hardened. His eyes went flat. "You might get your wish. Girl, you—" "Brand." The voice was a whip crack. Silas straightened up, turning slowly. Caleb stood 10 feet away. He wasn't wearing his coat today. His hand was resting loosely near his hip, not on his gun, but close enough. "I believe the lady is trying to get to work," Caleb said. Silas looked at Caleb, then back at Ada. He smoothed his lapels. A subtle, wordless rivalry passed between the two men. It wasn't just about Ada anymore. It was about land, about power, about the offense of a stranger standing up to a king. Silas stepped back. "Enjoy your time, Mr. Hart," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "The high plains have a way of breaking things that do not bend." He walked away, his boots crunching on the frost-hardened ground. Ada sagged against the wall, trembling violently. Caleb walked over to her. He didn't ask if she was okay this time. He just waited. Ada looked up at him. The dust swirled around them, gritty and biting. Wagons creaked nearby on the main street, the sound of a world that didn't care about her. "I will go," she said. Her voice was brittle, almost angry in its desperation. "I will come to your homestead." Caleb nodded once. "Good, but on my terms," she said, pushing off the wall. "I earn my keep. I pay for my own things. And the first time you treat me with anything less than respect, I walk. I do not care if it is a blizzard. I walk." Caleb looked her in the eye. He saw the fear behind the defiance, and the steel behind the fear. "Deal," he said. They left 2 days later. The wagon was small, loaded down with sacks of flour, coffee, tools, and Ada's meager trunk. Caleb drove the team, a pair of bays that blew steam into the cold morning air. Ada sat beside him on the bench seat, wrapped in her shawl and a heavy blanket Caleb had insisted she take. They rode through town in silence. Heads turned as they passed. The whispers were audible. "Shameless, fool, trouble." Ada kept her chin high, staring straight ahead at the ears of the horses. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her look back. As the buildings of Dry Creek receded, becoming small dark shapes against the vastness of the prairie, a strange sensation settled over her. It was terror. Yes, she was riding into the unknown with a man she barely knew. But beneath the terror was a lightness. The heavy blanket of the town's judgment was slipping away. The road was barely a track. Winding through the sagebrush and dry grass, the land opened up around them, huge and empty. To the west, the mountains rose like a wall of blue ice. To the east, the prairie rolled away endlessly, an ocean of brown grass under a pale sky. The wind was cold, carrying the scent of snow and pine. For the first few hours, they didn't speak. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels, the jingle of the harness, and the rhythmic thud of hooves. Around noon, Caleb cleared his throat. I was on a drive up from Texas before this, he said. He kept his eyes on the horizon. Ada glanced at him. It was an offering, a way to fill the silence that was growing too heavy. Texas? She asked. Yeah, dust all the way. Then we hit the Dakota Territory in winter. That is a cold I never want to feel again. We lost 30 head of cattle in one night, just froze standing up. He paused. My partner, Jim. He used to play the harmonica. Terrible at it. Sounded like a dying cat, but it kept us awake. He glanced at her, a small, self-deprecating smile touching his lips. Ada felt a smile tug at her own mouth, surprising her. My mother used to sing, she said softly. Before she got sick, she knew all the old ballads from back east. She tried to teach me, but I have no ear for it. Your father? Caleb asked gently. Ada stiffened, then forced herself to relax. He was a good man, she said. He worked hard. He loved horses. He did not steal those cattle. He was just in the wrong place. I believe you. Caleb said. The simplicity of it made her throat tight. They made camp as the sun went down. The sky turned a deep, bruised purple, then black, exploding with more stars than Ada had ever seen. The air was frigid. Caleb built a fire from dried sage and wood he had brought in the wagon. They ate a simple meal of beans and biscuits, sitting close to the fire for warmth. The darkness pressed in around them, vast and absolute. There were no town lights here, no other people, just the two of them in a bubble of orange firelight. Caleb poured coffee into a tin cup and handed it to her. Their fingers brushed. It happened again. That hum, low and tense, vibrating through the layers of wool and cotton. Ada took the cup, her heart beating a little faster. She looked at him over the rim of the cup. The firelight cast deep shadows on his face, highlighting the sharp line of his jaw and the sadness in his eyes. He was a handsome man, she realized with a jolt. Not smooth like Silas, but rugged and real. Caleb stared into the fire, acutely aware of her presence. He could smell the soap she used, a clean, sharp scent that cut through the wood smoke. He wanted to reach out and touch her hand again, to reassure her, to reassure himself. But he held himself still. He had made a promise. Respect. You should sleep, he said, his voice rough. We have a long way to go tomorrow. I am not tired yet, Ada said quietly. They sat there for a long time, shoulders almost touching, listening to the coyotes yip in the distance. It was a fragile peace, built on desperation and a gamble. But as the fire crackled and the sparks drifted up toward the Milky Way, Ada thought that maybe, just maybe, it was better than the safety of a cage. The dawn broke over the homestead not with a burst of glory, but with a pale, bruised light that struggled to penetrate the low-hanging clouds. The wagon had arrived in the pitch black of the previous night, so this was Ada Lee's first true look at the place she had agreed to call home. She stood on the frozen rut of the track, wrapping her shawl tight against the biting wind. The cabin crouched against a small rise in the land as if it were trying to hide from the weather. It was a rough structure of hewn logs, dark with age and weather, the chinking between them crumbling in places like old teeth. To the west, a barn leaned precariously to one side, its roof sagging under the weight of years. The pasture was a patch of scrubby, frost-silvered grass that looked too thin to support a rabbit, let alone a herd. And the creek that cut through the property ran thin and black between banks crusted with jagged ice. It was a desolate, lonely place. It was a place where silence lived. Ada surveyed it with a practical, unblinking eye. She counted 3 fence posts that had rotted through at the base. She noted the way the wind whistled through a gap in the cabin's eaves. She saw the poverty of the soil and the sheer, overwhelming scale of the work that needed to be done. It should have terrified her. She should have turned back to the wagon and demanded to be taken to the nearest train station. But as she looked at the broken barn and the struggling creek, she felt a strange, perverse spark of hope. This wreckage was honest. It did not pretend to be a palace. It did not hide its rot behind silk curtains or polite smiles like the town of Dry Creek. It was broken, yes, but it was open about it, Caleb came out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at her, then at the cabin, his expression guarded. "It is not much," he said, his voice flat. "I told you it was rough." Ada turned to him. She pulled the shawl tighter. "The roof needs patching before the snow gets heavy," she said. "And that corral fence will not hold a determined calf. But the logs are solid." Caleb blinked, surprised by her assessment. He nodded slowly. "I will get to the roof today." And so their rhythm began. It was a life governed not by clocks, but by light and necessity. Caleb was gone before the sun cleared the horizon, riding the range to check on his small, ragged herd of cattle. He spent his days fighting the land, mending wire, breaking ice on the water troughs, hunting for strays in the deep ravines where the wind cut like a knife. Ada waged her own war inside the cabin. She attacked the grime of bachelorhood with the same fierce determination she had used on the boarding house laundry. She hauled water from the creek, her fingers turning red and numb as she cracked the ice. She scrubbed the plank floors until her knees ached and the wood turned pale and clean. She aired out the musty bedding that smelled of stale smoke and damp wool, beating the mattresses in the cold wind until they smelled of nothing but air. She found old flour sacks and hemmed them into curtains to stop the drafts. She straightened the shelves, arranging the few tins of coffee and beans in neat rows. Slowly, agonizingly, the dark, cold space began to feel less like a cave and more like a home. But the harshness of the high plains was a constant companion. The wind never stopped. It seeped through the chinks in the logs, stirring the dust on the floor even with the door closed. Firewood was a hungry beast that always needed feeding. Ada learned to swing an axe, her arms trembling with the effort. Splitting the cottonwood logs Caleb dragged in. The land could be breathtaking in the morning, with the sunrise painting the frost in shades of diamond and pink. But by afternoon, under a gray, leaden sky, it looked utterly indifferent to whether they lived or died. Yet, in this hard soil, moments of tentative intimacy began to sprout. One evening, 2 weeks after they arrived, Ada cooked a stew. It was simple: dried beef, potatoes she had found in the root cellar, and an onion. She seasoned it with the last of the salt and a pinch of dried sage she had gathered near the porch. She set the bowl before Caleb as he sat at the rough-hewn table. He was exhausted, his face gray with fatigue. Dirt lined in the creases around his eyes. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of self-consciousness. It was such a plain meal. It was poor food for a man working this hard. Caleb ate in silence for a long time. The only sound was the spoon scraping the tin bowl and the pop of the fire in the hearth. Ada watched him, twisting her apron in her hands, waiting for a complaint. Finally, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He looked up at her, and his eyes were soft. "That is the best I have eaten since before Jim died," he said quietly. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. The warmth of the compliment settled in Ada's chest, shielding her against the draft that whistled under the door. Their evenings became a ritual. After the dishes were washed, they sat on opposite sides of the hearth. Ada mended his shirts by the light of the kerosene lamp, her needle flashing in the gloom. Caleb sat in the rocking chair, oiling his gun or whittling a new handle for a tool. They did not speak much. They were both people who had learned that words could be used as weapons, so they were careful with them. But the silence was companionable. Sometimes, glances lingered a second too long. Sometimes, beneath the small table, his boot would brush against the hem of her skirt, or her foot would bump his. The air would charge with a sudden, static electricity, and they would both pull back, breaths catching, eyes fixing studiously on their work. The partition Caleb had built, a heavy blanket hung on a rope across the back of the room, gave Ada her privacy. But the cabin was small. She could hear him breathing in his sleep. She knew he could hear her turning on the straw mattress. One night, the darkness brought the old terror. Ada was back in the square at Dry Creek. The sun was hot. The crowd was cheering. She saw her father standing on the wagon, his hands tied behind his back. She saw the rope. She saw Silas Brand smiling. She tried to scream, to run to him, but her feet were stuck in mud. The wagon moved. The rope snapped taut. Ada woke with a gasp. sitting bolt upright in the dark. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was sweating despite the freezing air of the room. A sob tore from her throat before she could stifle it. "Ada?" The voice came from the other side of the blanket. It was low, rough with sleep, and filled with concern. Ada pressed her hand over her mouth, trying to quiet her breathing. "I am fine," she choked out. "Go back to sleep." She heard the creak of the cot as Caleb sat up. She saw his shadow move against the faint glow of the dying embers in the fireplace. He did not come behind the curtain. He stayed on his side, respecting the line they had drawn. "I am right here," he said softly. "You are safe. The door is barred. Nothing is getting in." His presence, steady and calm, anchored her. The image of the swinging rope began to fade. Ada pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. "It was my father," she whispered into the dark. Caleb was silent, waiting. "I dreamed about the day they took him," she said. Her voice was shaking, but she couldn't stop the words. They did not even have a trial, not a real one. Silas Brand just said he saw the brand on the cattle. He said my father changed it, but my father, he didn't even own a running iron. She took a shuddering breath. "They hanged him from the cottonwood, the one by the creek. I was 16. I stood there and watched because I didn't want him to be alone. I didn't want the last thing he saw to be Silas Brand's face." The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with a shared weight. "I'm sorry," Caleb said. His voice was thick. "I see it every time I close my eyes." She confessed. "I know the feeling." Caleb said. Ada lifted her head. "You do?" She heard him shift in the dark. "The Red River." He said, 3 months ago. We were crossing a herd. The water was high, muddy. You couldn't see the bottom. A boy named Toby. He was just a kid. Really, he got spooked. His horse went over." Caleb paused. Ada could hear the pain in the silence. "I was right there," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "I could have grabbed him. I reached for my own reins first. Just a reflex. Just fear. By the time I threw the rope, he was gone, swept under. I see his fingers slipping out of the water every night." Ada pressed her forehead against her knees. Tears slipped hot down her cheeks. She realized then that he wasn't just the strong, silent cowboy who had saved her at the dance. He was like her. He was flawed. He was hurting. He was carrying a ghost just as heavy as hers. "You were afraid," Ada whispered. "That does not make you bad. It makes you human." "Maybe," Caleb said, "but it doesn't bring him back." Those confessions in the dark cracked something open between them. The next day, the air in the cabin felt different. They weren't just two people sharing a space for survival anymore. They were allies. They moved around each other with a new awareness. When Caleb handed her the water bucket that morning, his fingers lingered on the handle, brushing hers. When she poured his coffee, she stood a little closer to his chair, but the physical distance remained. Ada insisted on it, and Caleb, bound by his own guilt and his promise of respect, honored it. Yet, the tension grew. It was in the way he steadied her by the elbow when she slipped on a patch of ice near the creek, a touch that sent a jolt of heat rushing through her arm, making her breath hitch. It was in the way she watched him chop wood, her eyes tracing the line of his shoulders. The world outside, however, refused to leave them be. A week later, a buggy rattled up the track. It was Mrs. Vance, a woman from a ranch 5 miles east. She was a stern woman with a face like a dried apple. She claimed she was just passing by and wanted to see who had taken over the old homestead. She sat in the cabin, drinking the coffee Ada poured, her eyes darting around the room like a hawk hunting mice. She looked at the single room. She looked at the blanket partition. She looked at Ada's plain, mended dress and her rough hands. "So, Mrs.," Vance said, setting her cup down with a sharp clink. "You are the Lee girl, from town." "Yes, ma'am," Ada said, keeping her voice level. "And you are living here? With Mr. Hart." "I work for Mr. Hart," Ada said. "I am his housekeeper." "Mrs." Vance sniffed. "A housekeeper? Way out here? Well, I suppose people make do however they can. Though in my day, A woman cared about her reputation, even a woman with your family history. Ada stood rigid, her hands gripping her apron. She wanted to throw the woman out. She wanted to scream. Caleb entered the cabin then, bringing a gust of cold air with him. He saw Mrs. Vance. He saw Ada's pale face. "We are busy, Mrs. Vance," Caleb said. He didn't offer her a greeting. The woman stood up, smoothing her skirts. "I can see that. I will not keep you from your housekeeping." She left, but the damage was done. 2 days later, a passing trapper mentioned to Caleb that folks in town were saying he was shacking up with the hangman's daughter. The gossip had followed them. It had found them even here, in the middle of nowhere. Then came the letter. A rider from the Brand Ranch delivered it. He didn't dismount. He just handed the envelope to Caleb and rode off. Caleb opened it at the table. Ada watched him read, seeing his jaw tighten. "What is it?" she asked. "Silas," Caleb said. He tossed the letter onto the table. "He is offering to buy the place." Ada picked it up. The handwriting was elegant. Looping script. "My dear Mr. Heart. Concern for your well-being. Hard winters. Cattle prices dropping. A generous offer to relieve you of the burden." It was polite. It was civilized. And it was a threat. "He is saying we will fail," Ada said, looking up. "He is saying he will make sure we fail," Caleb corrected. "He wants the land, and he wants to punish me for standing up to him." Ada felt a cold knot of guilt in her stomach. "It is because of me," she said quietly. "If I weren't here, he might leave you alone. I am costing you trouble. Caleb, maybe I should go. Once I have earned enough for a train ticket." Caleb slammed his hand down on the table. The coffee cups jumped. "You are not going anywhere," he said, his voice rough. "You are not a burden. Ada, you are the only reason this place is still standing. I am not selling, and I am not letting him run you off." He looked at her, his eyes blazing. "We stay." Ada nodded, but the doubt lingered. Was she just an anchor dragging him down? The answer came on a night when the wind stopped howling and started screaming. The storm hit just after sundown. It wasn't just snow. It was a white wall of fury that slammed into the cabin, shaking the logs in their bedding. The temperature plummeted. Inside, the water in the bucket froze solid within an hour. Caleb was pacing by the window, trying to see out into the whiteout. "The calf," he muttered. "The roan cow dropped her calf 2 days ago. They were in the lower pasture. They haven't come up to the barn." He grabbed his heavy sheepskin coat. "I have to go get them." Ada stood up, fear clutching her throat. "You cannot go out there. Caleb, you will get lost. You cannot see your hand in front of your face. I cannot lose that calf." "Ada," he said grimly, "we need every head if we are going to make the payments." He pulled his hat down low and wrapped a scarf around his face. "Keep the fire up," he said. "Put a lamp in the window." Then he opened the door, and the storm swallowed him. Ada was alone. She paced the small cabin. She fed the fire until the chimney roared, but the cold still crept in. She pressed her face to the glass, but there was nothing but swirling white darkness. 10 minutes, 20, an hour. Her imagination, fueled by the nightmare, ran wild. She saw him falling into a ravine. She saw him freezing to death, his body covered in snow. Just like the cattle he had talked about in the Dakotas, she saw herself alone in this cabin, waiting for a ghost. "Please," she whispered to the empty room. "Please, not him. Do not take him too." She realized then, with a terrifying clarity, that she wasn't just afraid of being alone. She was afraid of losing him. 2 hours passed. The woodpile was dwindling. Ada was putting on her own coat, grabbing the lantern, preparing to go out into the madness. When the door burst open, Caleb stumbled in. He was a snowman, covered in white from head to toe. In his arms, he cradled a bundle wrapped in his own saddle blanket. The calf. He kicked the door shut, stumbling toward the fire. He dropped to his knees, his movements jerky and stiff. "Caleb!" Ada cried. She rushed to him. He was shivering violently, his teeth chattering so hard it sounded like bones rattling. His face was gray-white, his lips blue. "Takes the coat," he stammered. "Can't feel hands." He was freezing. Hypothermia. Ada knew the signs. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She dropped to her knees beside him. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the frozen buttons of his coat. "Let me help," she said. "I have got you." She peeled the heavy, ice-stiffened sheepskin off him. Beneath it, his shirt was soaked through with melted snow and sweat. His skin was like ice. "Boots," she commanded. She tugged his heavy boots off, throwing them aside. He was shaking so hard he could barely sit up. "We need to get you warm," she said. She dragged the mattress from behind the curtain, pulling it close to the fire. She helped him move onto it. He was dead weight, exhausted and frozen. She grabbed the heavy wool blankets from her bed and his. She wrapped them around him, but he was still shaking, violent spasms that racked his whole body. "It is not working," he gritted out. "Cold. So cold." Ada knew what she had to do. It was a survival knowing, deeper than propriety. She kicked off her own boots. She climbed under the mountain of blankets with him. She wrapped her arms around his freezing body, pressing herself against him. She could feel the cold radiating off him, searing her own warm skin. Caleb groaned, a sound of pain and relief. "I am here," she whispered, rubbing his back vigorously, trying to generate friction, trying to push her own heat into him. "I am here." She pressed her chest to his back, wrapping her legs around his, slowly, agonizingly. The violent shaking began to subside. He turned in her arms, seeking the warmth. They ended up chest to chest, huddled under the wool in the firelight. Caleb's breath came in ragged gasps against her hair. His heart was pounding against hers, a slow, heavy thudding that matched the rhythm of her own. Ada looked up. His face was inches from hers. The blue was fading from his lips, replaced by a flush of returning blood. His eyes were open, dark and dilated, staring at her with an intensity that burned. It wasn't just gratitude in his gaze. It was hunger. It was a raw, unspoken need that had nothing to do with the cold. Ada felt her own body respond. The heat between them wasn't just thermal anymore. It was alive. She was acutely aware of the hardness of his chest, the weight of his leg over hers, the roughness of his unshaven cheek. "Caleb." She breathed. His hand came up, his fingers trembling, not from cold this time, to touch her face. He traced the line of her jaw. "Ada," he whispered. "You stayed. I stayed," she said. For a long, trembling minute, they lay there. The world outside howled and raged, but under the blanket, the silence was thick with desire. He leaned in slightly. She tilted her head back. Their lips were a breath apart. Then, Caleb stiffened. He squeezed his eyes shut for a second, a look of pained restraint crossing his face. He pulled back, just an inch, but it felt like a mile. "We can't," he rasped. "Not like this. Not because I'm frozen and you are scared." Ada let out a shaky breath. He was right. If they crossed this line now, in the desperation of the storm, they could never go back, and the world would destroy them for it. She nodded, though her body cried out at the loss of contact. "You are right." She pulled away, sitting up and tucking the blanket tighter around him. "You stay here," she said, her voice unsteady. "Get warm. I will sleep in the chair." She stood up, her legs wobbling. She looked down at him. He was watching her, his eyes dark with a promise and a warning. They both knew, as the fire popped and the wind battered the logs, that something powerful had taken root in the dark. It was a love born of ice and survival, and it was dangerous. But as Ada settled into the hard rocking chair, watching the rise and fall of his chest, she knew she would fight the whole world to keep it. Winter did not come to the high plains with a whisper. It came like a judgment. By January, the world had been reduced to two colors, the blinding, achingly bright white of the snow and the flat, dead gray of the sky. The wind had ceased to be a weather event and had become a permanent resident of the valley. a living thing that hunted for cracks in the chinking and gaps in the window frames. It piled snow into drifts that swallowed the fence lines whole, turning the familiar geography of the homestead into a deceptive, undulating sea where a man could step off a hidden ridge and sink to his chest. Caleb Hart fought the season with a grim, silent determination. He spent his daylight hours battling the drifts to reach the cattle. The herd was suffering. Despite the hay he had stockpiled in the shelter of the creek bottom, the animals were gaunt, their ribs pressed against their hides like the staves of a barrel, and their breath plumed in weak, fitful bursts. Every morning, Caleb rode out with a feeling of dread in his gut, counting heads, looking for the telltale dark mounds in the snow that meant another loss. The struggle inside the cabin was less physical but no less desperate. The money jar on the mantel, a cracked crockery pot Ada had found in the barn, was growing light. The feed bill was higher than Caleb had calculated, the price of grain driven up by the harshness of the season. One morning, with the frost thick on the inside of the window panes, Caleb saddled the bay mare and tied the lead rope of a stout roan gelding to his saddle horn. The roan was a good horse, steady and quick, one of the best in his small string. Ada stood on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching him. She knew what it meant. "You are selling him?" she asked, her voice snatched away by the wind. Caleb did not look at her. He busied himself with the knot. "We need the flour, Ada, and the cattle need more corn if they are going to make it to March." He rode out, a dark silhouette against the blinding white. When he returned that evening, the roan was gone, and he placed a small stack of coins and bills on the table. He pushed $2 silver toward Ada. "Your wages," he said. Ada looked at the silver. She looked at his face, which was drawn and gray with fatigue. She knew he had loved that horse. She reached out, took the coins, and walked to the crockery jar. She dropped them in. The clink was loud in the quiet room. "Ada," Caleb said, his voice warning. "I do not need anything this week," she said, turning her back to him to stir the beans on the fire. "My boots are fine. My dress is holding." "You earned it," he said. "And I am spending it," she countered, facing him with a flash of defiance in her eyes. "On corn, for the herd, because if they die, Caleb, it does not matter how much silver I have in my pocket. We both starve." He looked at her for a long moment, the firelight catching the stubborn set of her jaw. He wanted to argue, to insist on his pride, but he was too tired, and she was too right. He nodded once, a sharp jerk of his chin, and sat down to pull off his boots. By February, the isolation was beginning to fray their nerves. The supplies were dangerously low. The flour sack was a limp rag, and the coffee tin contained only dust. A trip to Dry Creek was no longer a choice. It was a necessity. Ada felt a cold pit open in her stomach when Caleb announced he was taking the wagon in. She terrified of the town. She terrified of the eyes, the whispers, the way the air seemed to curdle when she walked by. But she looked at the list of supplies, then at the heavy sacks of grain that would need to be hauled. Caleb's shoulder had been bothering him since he wrenched it pulling a cow from a drift a week ago. "I am coming with you," she said. "You do not have to," Caleb said, pausing in the act of oiling the harness. "I can manage. I know you can manage," Ada said, putting on her coat. "But you should not have to. And I need needles and thread." It was a lie, mostly. She had enough thread, but she would not let him face the town alone. And she would not sit in this cabin for 2 days imagining him freezing on the trail or getting into a brawl with Silas Brand's men. The journey was brutal. The wagon wheels crunched and squealed over the frozen ruts. The wind bit through every layer of wool they wore. By the time the buildings of Dry Creek appeared on the horizon, gray and huddled against the white expanse, Ada's hands were numb, and her face felt like a mask of ice. The town was busy despite the cold. Wagons were lined up at the feed store, and smoke pumped vigorously from every chimney. As Caleb pulled the team up in front of the general store, the reaction was immediate. A group of men loading a buckboard stopped their work. They leaned on the side of their wagon, staring. Conversations on the boardwalk died out. Ada felt the weight of their gazes like a physical blow. She squared her shoulders, lifting her chin. She remembered the heat of Caleb's hand on her back at the dance. "She is the finest woman here." She repeated the words in her mind like a shield. "Stay close," Caleb murmured as he helped her down. They entered the general store. The heat from the potbelly stove hit them, carrying the scents of tobacco, damp wool, and pickled herring. The store was crowded. As the door chimed shut behind them, the hum of talk dropped an octave, then sharpened into the buzzing whisper of a hive disturbed. Ada walked straight to the fabric counter, eyes fixed forward. Caleb moved to the counter where the clerk, a nervous young man with slicked back hair, was weighing nails, while Caleb read out his list. Flour, beans, coffee, corn. The bell above the door jingled again. A draft of cold air swept through the room, followed by a presence that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the space. Silas Brand walked in. He was wearing a heavy buffalo hide coat with a collar of beaver fur, looking every inch the king of the valley. He stomped the snow from his polished boots and looked around the room. His eyes landed on Caleb, then slid over to Ada. "Well," Silas said, his voice booming with a jovial, false warmth, "if it isn't our homesteaders. I was wondering if the snow had buried you two up there yet." He walked toward them, the crowd parting to give him a wide berth. He stopped near Ada, looking her up and down. She was wearing her old coat, patched at the elbows, and a scarf wrapped around her head. "You are looking sturdy." "Ada," Silas said, "country life must agree with you. Or perhaps it is the company." He glanced at Caleb, a smirk playing on his lips. "It must be very comfortable in that little cabin, just the two of you. Long winter nights. I suppose a man does not need much firewood when he has other ways to keep warm." The insinuation was gross and heavy. A few men near the stove chuckled. Ada's stomach twisted. She felt dirty, as if his words were greasy fingerprints on her skin. Caleb turned from the counter. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for the gun at his hip. He simply went still. It was the stillness of a wolf before it snaps. "We are managing fine." "Brand," Caleb said. "The lady is well, and she is under my protection." Silas laughed. A dry sound. "Protection? Yes, I am sure you are very thorough in your duties. Mr. Hart." He took a step closer to Caleb, lowering his voice so that it was an intimate murmur between the two of them, though his eyes remained cold as stones. "Speaking of duties," Silas said, "I thought we might have a word. Business." Caleb's eyes narrowed. He looked at Ada, who was standing rigid by the calico bolts. "I am buying supplies. This concerns your land," Silas said softly. Caleb hesitated, then nodded. He stepped away from the counter, following Silas to a quiet corner of the store near the barrels of salted pork. Silas turned, his back to the room. The jovial mask dropped. "I bought the note on your land." "Hart," he said. Caleb stared at him. "The bank holds the note, and I own the bank," Silas said. "I reviewed the paperwork. There is a clause, a standard thing, really, but it allows me to call in the full amount if I deem the security of the loan to be at risk." He picked up a handful of dried beans from an open barrel and let them trickle through his gloved fingers. "And with this winter," Silas continued, "and your questionable judgment in partners, I feel the risk is high." He looked at Caleb. "You have two choices. You sell to me now, I will give you a fair price, enough to get a train ticket south. Or you get rid of the girl, put her somewhere she belongs, a mining camp, perhaps, or back here, where I can keep an eye on her. Do that, and maybe I will let the note stand until spring." Caleb's hands curled into fists at his sides. The rage was a white-hot flare in his chest. "You are trying to blackmail me." "I am doing business," Silas said. "You have until the first thaw to decide, but do not think you can keep both the land and the girl. That is a luxury you cannot afford." Silas patted Caleb on the shoulder, a gesture of contempt, and walked away, calling out a greeting to the store owner as if nothing had happened. On the other side of the store, Ada was fighting her own battle. She was looking at a bolt of thick, blue wool It was warm. It was beautiful. It was the color of the summer sky. She reached out to touch it, imagining how it would feel to sew a dress that wasn't falling apart. "That is $3 a yard," a voice said. Ada turned. "Mrs." Gable stood there, flanked by two other women, the baker's wife and the miller's widow. They stood like a wall of black bombazine in judgment. "A bit rich for your blood, isn't it?" "Mrs." Gable said. "Unless he is paying you extra for special services." The women tittered. "You are going to ruin him. You know." The miller's widow said, leaning in. "He was a decent man when he rode in here. Now look at him, spending his money to feed a rustler's daughter, dragging his name through the mud. He will wake up eventually." "Mrs." Gable added. "Men always do, and when he realizes he has thrown his life away on trash, he will leave you, and you will have nothing, just like you deserve." Ada's hand dropped from the blue wool. The words cut through her defense. They echoed the deepest fear in her heart, that she was a poison, that she was dragging Caleb down, that she was the reason he was struggling. She felt the tears pricking her eyes, hot and sudden. She bit her lip until she tasted copper. "I will take 5 yards of the gray muslin," she told the clerk, pointing to the cheapest, thinnest fabric on the bottom shelf. "But the wool is much warmer." "Ma'am," the clerk stammered. "The muslin." Ada snapped. She paid with the coins from her pocket, the coins she had saved from her own laundry work, and clutched the brown paper parcel to her chest. She felt small. She felt ragged. She felt that no matter how clean she scrubbed her skin, she would always be the thing they said she was. The ride back to the homestead was silent. The silence was not the companionable quiet of the evenings by the fire. It was thick and heavy, suffocating. Caleb was brooding over Silas's threat, his mind racing for a way out that didn't involve losing everything. Ada was curled in upon herself, the women's words replaying in her mind like a curse. They arrived at the cabin as the sun was setting, casting long, purple shadows across the snow. They unloaded the wagon in silence. As Caleb dropped the last sack of flour onto the table, the tension finally snapped. Caleb saw the parcel of thin muslin Ada had bought. He frowned. "I thought you needed wool," he said. "That stuff is too thin for winter." "It is fine," Ada said, her voice tight. "It is what I could afford. I told you to put it on my account," Caleb said, his frustration bubbling over. "Your account?" Ada spun around. "Your account that is already overextended? Do you think I do not know? Do you think I am stupid? I am handling it." Caleb snapped. "Handling it?" Ada laughed, a sharp, hysterical sound. "Like you handled Silas in the store? I saw him corner you. I saw the look on his face. He is going to crush you, Caleb. And it is because of me. It is not because of you," Caleb shouted. "It is because he is a greedy snake who wants this valley. It is because I am trash." Ada screamed back. The word tore out of her throat. "That is what they called me. That is what I am. I am the rustler's daughter. I am the stain on this town. And you are a fool for thinking you can clean me up." She was shaking. Tears were streaming down her face now. "You do not know what it is like," she cried. "You do not know what it is like to have people look at you and see nothing but dirt. You think you are noble. You think you are saving me. But you are just drowning with me." Caleb stared at her. Her words hit him like stones. He felt his own fear rising, the fear that he was failing, the fear that he was the hesitation that cost lives, the fear that Silas was right. "I am not drowning," he yelled. "I am fighting. I am risking everything I have. This land, my name, my life, to give us a chance, to give you a place where you do not have to be afraid." "Us?" Ada choked out. "There is no us, Caleb." "There is you, and there is the charity case you picked up because you felt guilty about a dead boy in a river." The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the wind howling outside. Caleb looked at her, his face pale. The hurt in his eyes was raw and deep. "Is that what you think?" he whispered. He turned and walked out the door, slamming it behind him. Ada stood in the center of the room, the silence ringing in her ears. She sank to the floor, burying her face in her hands, and wept. An hour later, the fire had burned low. The cabin was cooling rapidly. Ada wiped her face. She felt hollowed out, scraped clean by the argument. She stood up and put on her coat. She found him standing by the corral fence. The night was clear and brutal. The stars were shards of ice in the black sky. He was leaning against the post, looking out at the dark shapes of the cattle. Ada walked up to the fence. She stood 10 feet away from him. The cold air burned her lungs, sharp and cleansing. "I am sorry," she said. Her voice was small in the vastness of the night. Caleb did not move for a long time. Then he let out a long breath, a plume of white in the dark. "I am scared." "Ada," he said. He turned to look at her. His face was shadowed, but his voice was open. "I am scared that Silas is going to win. I am scared that I do not know how to be a rancher. I'm scared that everything I touch turns to ash. That boy, Jim. Now this place, I'm afraid I am just a man who brings bad luck." Ada stepped closer. The snow crunched under her boots. "You are not bad luck," she said. "You are the only good thing that has happened to me." She looked up at the stars. "I said those things because I was trying to push you away. Before you could push me away, I thought if I left first, it would hurt less. Loneliness makes you do strange things," Caleb said softly. "It makes you think kindness is a trap." "It usually is," Ada said. "Not here," Caleb said. "Not with me." He took a step toward her. He took his glove off. He reached out his hand, palm up. It was a question. Ada looked at his hand. It was rough, scarred, trembling slightly from the cold. She took off her own mitten. She placed her hand in his. His fingers curled around hers. His skin was rough, but his grip was steady. It was an anchor. "I promise," Caleb said, his voice husky. "I promise I will not turn on you. No matter what Silas does, no matter what the town says, we stand together." Ada squeezed his hand. Together. They stood there for a moment, hand in hand under the starlight, two small figures against the immense indifference of the winter night. Then the cold became too much. "Come inside," Caleb said. "You are freezing." Back in the cabin, the air was still chilly, but the tension had broken. Caleb built up the fire until the flames licked the soot-stained bricks. Ada did not go behind her curtain. She sat on the braided rug before the hearth. Caleb sat beside her. They did not sit apart this time. They sat shoulder to shoulder, their arms pressing against each other. Ada could feel the heat of his body seeping through the layers of wool and cotton. It was a comfort she hadn't known she was starving for. "It will be spring soon," Caleb murmured, staring into the flames. "The Chinook winds will come. The grass will turn green. It will look like a whole different world. I want to plant a garden," Ada said softly. "Near the creek. Potatoes, maybe some peas." "That sounds good," Caleb said. "Fresh peas." He turned his head to look at her. The firelight painted her face in soft orange and gold. It softened the lines of worry around her eyes. She looked beautiful. Not the kind of beautiful Silas Brand wanted to own, but the kind of beautiful that endured. He lifted his hand, slowly, giving her all the time in the world to pull away. He reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. His thumb lingered on her cheekbone. His skin was rough, but his touch was impossibly gentle. Ada's breath hitched. She did not pull away. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. "Caleb," she breathed. He shifted, turning his body toward hers. His hand cupped her face. She could feel the pulse in his wrist against her jaw. He leaned in. It was slow, a question asked in the closing of distance. Ada tilted her chin up. Their lips met. It was not like the kisses in the dime novels. It was hesitant at first, a testing of boundaries. His lips were chapped from the wind, warm and firm. Ada's hands came up, clutching the front of his flannel shirt, holding him there. Then the hesitation broke. Years of hunger, of loneliness, of being told they were unworthy, poured into the space between them. The kiss deepened. It became urgent, hungry. Caleb's arm came around her, pulling her flush against him. His other hand tangled in her hair. Ada made a small sound in her throat, opening to him. She tasted coffee and desperation. She felt the strength in his arms, the solid reality of him. It was a fire hotter than the one in the hearth. It was terrifying and exhilarating. For a moment, they were not two broken people fighting a hard land. They were just a man and a woman who had found a way to be warm. They pulled apart slowly, breathless. Their foreheads rested against each other. Ada's heart was hammering against her ribs, a wild rhythm that matched his. Caleb's eyes were dark, the pupils blown wide. He looked shaken. "Ada," he whispered. She looked at him, her lips swollen, her eyes bright. She wanted to pull him back. She wanted to forget the separate beds and the curtain and the propriety. She wanted to lose herself in him. But the reality of their world pressed in. Silas, the debt, the town. If they crossed this line fully, if they gave in to the desire that was humming between them, they would be binding themselves together in a way that couldn't be undone. And if they lost the land, if they were forced onto the road? Caleb took a jagged breath. He smoothed her hair back, his hand trembling. "We have to be careful," he said. His voice was ragged. "I know," Ada whispered. She didn't want to be careful, but she understood. They sat back, putting a few inches of distance between them. But the air had changed. The boundary had shifted. Every glance, every brush of hands as they banked the fire for the night, carried a current of longing. They were walking a razor's edge now, and they both knew that sooner or later they would fall. Spring arrived on the high plains late and with a grudge. It did not come with gentle showers and sudden greenery, but with a slow, agonizing thaw that turned the frozen earth into a sucking gray mud. The drifts that had swallowed the fences in January collapsed into dirty mounds of slush, revealing the battered bones of the homestead beneath. The cabin roof had held, barely, but the barn listed dangerously to the south, and the corral fence lay in splinters where the heavy snow had snapped the pine posts. The herd was smaller. Caleb rode out every morning into the raw, damp air, counting the survivors. They were gaunt, their coats rough and patchy, ribs heaving as they searched for the new grass pushing up through the mud. A few stubborn wildflowers, pasque flowers with their fuzzy stems, poked their heads up on the south-facing slopes, purple bruises against the brown land. They looked fragile, but they had survived the ice, which was more than could be said for 5 of Caleb's best heifers. It was on a Tuesday, under a sky the color of a wet slate, that the blow fell. Caleb returned from the mail drop on the main road, his horse's legs caked in mud up to the knees. He carried a single envelope. He sat at the table, his hands still shaking slightly from the ride, and tore it open. Ada watched him from the hearth where she was mending a tear in his canvas coat. She saw the color drain from his face. The lines around his mouth, already etched deep by the hard winter, seemed to carve themselves into stone. "What is it?" she asked, lowering the needle. Caleb laid the paper on the table. He stared at it as if it were a rattlesnake coiled to strike. "It is from the bank," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of inflection. "Silas is calling in the note. But you said we had until autumn," Ada said, rising. "You said the payments were set. He found a clause," Caleb said, "a pretext. He claims the value of the collateral, the herd, has dropped below the security threshold because of the winter losses. He has the right to demand the full balance immediately to cover the risk." Ada moved to the table and looked at the document. It was written in dense, polite legalese, a language of traps and snares, due to significant depreciation of assets. Immediate remittance required. Sum of $800, payable by the 1st of June. $800, Ada whispered. It was a fortune. It might as well have been $1 million. We do not have $800. We barely have 8. "I know," Caleb said. He rubbed his face with his hands, a gesture of exhaustion that frightened her more than his anger would have. Ada felt a cold, crushing weight settle on her chest. It was guilt, sharp and familiar. She knew why this was happening. It wasn't about the herd. It wasn't about the market. It was about the general store. It was about the way Caleb had stood between her and Silas Brand. "He is doing this to punish you," she said quietly, "because you would not sell, because you would not put me out." Caleb did not look up. "He is doing it because he is a thief with a fancy suit." "No, Caleb," Ada said. Her voice rose, trembling. "It is me. He told you to get rid of the girl. If I wasn't here, if I hadn't let you defend me." She stepped back, her hands twisting in her apron. "I should go. If I leave now, maybe he will back off. Maybe if the town sees I am gone, Silas will think he won and let the note stand." Caleb looked up then. His eyes were dark, red-rimmed from the wind. "Stop," he said. "It is the only way," Ada insisted, tears pricking her eyes. "I can go to Cheyenne. I can find work. You can tell everyone you kicked me out. You can save the land. I said stop." Caleb stood up so fast the chair scraped loudly against the wood floor. He walked around the table and took her by the shoulders. His grip was hard, desperate. "Do you think I am fighting for this dirt?" he asked, shaking her slightly. "Do you think I broke my back all winter just to own a few acres of rocks and mud?" He looked down at her, his face inches from hers. "I am fighting for a home, Ada." "And it is not a home without you. You are not some burden I am dragging around. You are the only reason I get up in the morning. You are the only reason I haven't ridden out and put a bullet in Silas Brand's chest." Ada stared at him, stunned by the ferocity in his voice. "If you leave," Caleb said, lowering his voice to a rough whisper, "then he wins. He takes everything that matters. We stay. We pay him, or we make him fight us for every inch." Ada looked into his eyes and saw the truth there. He would not let her go. And she realized, with a jolt of terrifying clarity, that she could not bear to go. "Then we fight," she said, but they could not fight with empty pockets. The $800 loomed over them like a storm cloud. "I have a plan," Ada said the next morning. Caleb was sharpening his axe, the rhythmic rasp of the stone filling the room. "What plan?" "I am going to town," she said. "Not to shop, to work." Caleb stopped. "Ada, no." "You know what they will say. You know how they will treat you. Let them talk," Ada said, tying her bonnet strings with steady fingers. "Talk does not pay the bank. I can sew. I can clean. I can do things the ranch wives are too tired or too proud to do. There are people in that valley who are not under Silas's thumb." She looked at him. "You have to stay here. You have to get those fences up and that ground broken if we are going to have any hope of a crop. You cannot do both." Caleb hated it. She could see it in the set of his jaw. He hated sending her back into the lion's den, but he looked at the calendar on the wall. The days ticking down to June, and he nodded. "Take the mare," he said, "and take the gun." "I do not need the gun," Ada said. "I have my scissors." She rode into Dry Creek with her head high, though her stomach was churning. She did not go to the general store. She did not go to the places where the young wives gathered to gossip. She went to the back doors. She went to the home of Mrs. Higgins, an older widow who lived on the edge of town. Mrs. Higgins remembered Ada's mother. She remembered a time before the hanging. She opened the door, looked at Ada's worn dress and determined face, and let her in. "I have curtains that need hemming, Mrs. Higgins said gruffly, "and my arthritis is bad this week. I cannot scrub the floors." "Thank you," Ada said. It was a start. For the next 3 weeks, Ada worked herself to the bone. She rode into town at dawn and rode back at dusk. She scrubbed floors until her hands were raw. She mended shirts, darned socks, and turned collars. She faced rejection. Mrs. Abernathy slammed the door in her face without a word, and the clerk at the millinery sneered and turned his back when she asked if they needed help. But she found cracks in the wall of prejudice. The blacksmith's wife, overwhelmed with a new baby, hired her to do the washing. She didn't offer tea, and she didn't make conversation, but she paid in silver and didn't look at Ada with hate. It was a transaction. That was enough. Back at the homestead, Caleb was fighting his own battle. He attacked the land with a frenzy. He dug post holes in the rocky soil until his hands were blistered and bleeding. He broke a small field near the creek for a vegetable garden. wrestling the plow through the tangle of roots. He pushed his body to the point of collapse, trying to wring value out of the earth, trying to prove that the land was worth saving. Every evening, when Ada rode in, he would be waiting on the porch. He would take her horse, his eyes scanning her face for signs of tears or hurt. They would eat in tired silence, counting the coins Ada brought home. It was never enough, but the pile was growing. Then came the evening the shadows stretched too long. Ada had stayed late in town to finish a heavy batch of ironing for the doctor's wife. The sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows down the alley behind the general store where she had tied her horse. The town was quiet, the dinner hour settling over the houses. She hurried toward the hitching rail, clutching her few dollars in her pocket. In a hurry, "Miss Lee?" Ada stopped. Silas Brand stepped out from the shadows of the store's loading dock. He was smoking a cigar, the ember glowing red in the twilight. He blocked her path through the horse. He was alone, but his presence filled the narrow alley. "Mr. Brand," Ada said, keeping her voice steady. "Please let me pass." "You have been busy," Silas said, taking a step closer. "Scrubbing floors, washing other men's dirt. It seems beneath you." "Ada, I told you, I could offer you a much softer life." "I am not interested in your offers," Ada said. She tried to step around him, but he moved with surprising speed, catching her arm. He didn't grip hard, but his fingers were like iron bands. He pulled her slightly toward him, backing her against the rough wood of the loading dock. "He is not going to make the payment." "Ada," Silas said softly. His other hand came up to rest on the wall beside her head, boxing her in. $800? He will never raise it. He is a failure. And when I take the land, he will drift on. But you. He leaned in, the smell of tobacco and stale whiskey washing over her. "You could help him," Silas whispered. "I could be persuaded to extend the deadline, to forgive a portion of the debt. If you were willing to show some gratitude. If you were willing to earn it." Ada felt a flash of white-hot terror. It was a memory, a drunk hand in a saloon grabbing her wrist, a man in a barn when she was 17 trying to corner her, the feeling of being small, of being prey. But then she remembered Caleb. She remembered him standing in the snow, telling her she was the only reason he fought. She remembered the weight of the silver dollars in her pocket that she had earned with her own sweat. She was not that scared girl anymore. "Get away from me," Ada shouted. She didn't freeze. She didn't beg. She shoved him. She placed both hands on his chest and pushed with all the strength she had built hauling water and scrubbing floors. Silas, surprised by the force of it, stumbled back a step. "Do not touch me," Ada yelled, her voice echoing off the brick walls of the alley. "I am not yours to bargain with." Silas's face twisted. The mask of civility dropped, revealing a snarl of pure malice. "You little—" "Hey!" a voice piped up from the end of the alley. It was Timmy, the livery boy, holding a bucket of oats. He stared at them, eyes wide. Silas straightened his coat, composing himself instantly. He glared at Ada. "You will regret that," he hissed. He turned and walked away, brushing past the boy without a word. Ada stood trembling against the wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She untied her horse with shaking fingers and scrambled into the saddle, galloping out of town as if the devil himself were snapping at her heels. Timmy didn't keep quiet. He ran to the livery, where a ranch hand from a neighboring spread was shoeing a horse. By the time the sun was fully down, the story was circulating. Silas Brand had cornered the Lee girl, and she had fought him off. The news reached the homestead the next morning via a passing freighter who stopped for water. He told Caleb, thinking it was just a piece of town gossip. "Silas Brand," the man said, chewing on a straw. "Heard he got a bit fresh with your housekeeper in the alley. Boy said she nearly knocked him down." Caleb went still. He looked at Ada, who was scrubbing a pot at the pump. She hadn't told him. She had come home pale and quiet, but she hadn't told him. Caleb dropped the bucket he was holding. He walked to the barn and saddled the big bay. He didn't take the wagon. He took the rifle from the scabbard and checked the load. Then he checked the colt on his hip. "Caleb!" Ada cried, running toward him. "No! Do not go!" He didn't look at her. His eyes were cold, dead things, Stay here. Ada. He rode out at a gallop, mud flying from the hooves. When he reached Dry Creek, he didn't slow down. He rode straight down the main street, pulling the horse up hard in front of the bank. He swung down, his boots hitting the boardwalk with a heavy thud. "Silas!" he roared. The street went silent. People stopped on the sidewalks. The door of the bank opened, and Silas stepped out. He was flanked by two of his hired hands, men who wore their guns low and tied down. Silas looked calm, but his eyes were wary. "Mr. Hart, to what do I owe the pleasure? You touched her," Caleb said. He walked into the middle of the street. His hands hung loose at his sides. Silas smiled. "A thin, cruel thing. I have no idea what you are talking about. I had a conversation with Miss Lee. She seemed hysterical. Perhaps the strain of her position is getting to her." "Do not lie to me," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a growl. "If you ever come near her again, if you ever try to corner her, I will kill you." Silas's men stepped forward, their hands hovering over their pistols. "Is that a threat?" Silas asked. "Because threatening a prominent citizen, that is a crime. Mr. Hart, and my men here, they are very protective. It is a promise," Caleb said. He took a step forward. Silas's men tensed. One of them, a man with a scar across his nose, shoved Caleb back. "Back off." "Cowboy," the man said. Caleb didn't back off. He shoved the man back, hard. For a second, the violence hung in the air like a poised guillotine. Hands twitched toward guns. Caleb felt the urge to draw, to let the rage take over, to end this the way men in the West ended things. But then he saw the sheriff stepping out of his office, shotgun in hand. He saw the town watching. He realized that if he drew, if he fired, he was giving Silas exactly what he wanted. He would be the violent drifter, the killer. He would hang, or go to prison, and Ada would be left alone. "Enough," Sheriff Brady shouted, leveling the shotgun. "Break it up." Caleb forced his hands away from his belt. He breathed, a ragged, painful sound. Silas smoothed his lapels. "Sheriff, this man came here making threats. I heard him. Brady said—" He looked at Caleb. "You are on thin ice. Hart, I know Silas pushes, but you cannot come into my town screaming murder." Caleb glared at Silas. "You know what you did." Silas just smiled. "The 1st of June, Mr. Hart. Tick-tock." Caleb mounted his horse. He felt sick. He felt impotent. He had wanted to smash Silas's face in, but he had ridden away. He rode back to the homestead in a dark haze. When he arrived, Ada was waiting on the porch. She looked terrified. Did you hurt him?" she asked. Caleb swung down. "No, I didn't." He walked past her into the cabin and collapsed into a chair. He buried his face in his hands. "I wanted to," he whispered. "God, Ada, I wanted to kill him. But I couldn't, because if I did, I would lose you." Ada closed the door and barred it. She walked over to him. She didn't touch him at first. "You think fighting him is the only way to protect me," she said softly. "It is what men do," Caleb said, looking up. "We fight." Ada pulled a chair close to his. She sat down, her knees touching his. "Listen to me." "Caleb," she took his hands. They were rough, trembling with adrenaline. "Men like Silas, they want you to fight," she said. "They want you to lose control, because then they can call you a savage. They can lock you up." She took a breath. "I have been dealing with men like him my whole life. Since I was 12, I know how they look. I know how they corner you. And I learned a long time ago that you cannot always fight them with fists. Sometimes you have to be small, sometimes you have to be sharp. You negotiate, you survive." She squeezed his hands. "You riding in there. It was brave. But it terrified me, because I don't need a hero in a grave. Caleb, I need a partner who is here." Caleb looked at her. He saw the strength in her face, a strength that had nothing to do with guns. He realized, with a humbling jolt, that she had been fighting this battle long before he arrived. "I feel helpless," he admitted. "I couldn't stop him from scaring you." "You stopped him," Ada said. "You came, and you didn't throw your life away. That means more to me than if you had shot him." It means you chose me over your pride. The tension in the room shifted. The rage drained out of Caleb, leaving a raw, aching exhaustion. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers. "I am so tired. Ada," he whispered. "I know," she said. "I am too." They sat there for a long time, the firelight flickering over them. The emotional exhaustion stripped away the last of their defenses, the barriers they had built, the curtain, the separate beds, the careful distance, felt suddenly flimsy, pointless against the magnitude of what they were facing. Caleb shifted. His hands moved from hers to her arms, sliding up to her shoulders. He pulled her closer. Ada didn't resist. She needed to feel him. She needed to know he was solid and warm and real. She moved from her chair to his lap, wrapping her arms around his neck. It wasn't a calculated move. It was gravity. Caleb buried his face in the crook of her neck. He breathed in the scent of her, soap and wind and skin. His hands moved over her back, mapping the muscles that had grown strong from work. "Ada," he murmured against her skin. She shivered. The sensation of his breath on her neck sent a shockwave through her. She ran her fingers through his hair, feeling the coarseness of it. They kissed. It wasn't hesitant this time. It was deep and desperate, a seeking of shelter in each other. Caleb's hands moved to her waist, pulling her flush against him. Ada could feel the hard planes of his chest, the beat of his heart. Her mind was a whirlwind. Part of her was screaming that this was wrong, that she was the rustler's daughter and he was the ruined cowboy, that they were confirming every nasty rumor the town had whispered. Shame, old and deep, tried to rise up. "You are earning it the way your kind always does." But then she looked at him. She saw the way he looked at her, not with greed, like Silas, but with a reverence that made her chest ache. He wasn't taking, he was asking. Caleb's hand moved to the buttons of her bodice. He undid the top one, his fingers grazing her collarbone. Then he stopped. His hand trembled. He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers. "Ada," he whispered. "Are you sure?" The tenderness of it broke her. He was holding back. He was shaking with the effort of not taking what he wanted, because he wanted her to be safe more than he wanted to be satisfied. Ada touched his cheek. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the desire warring with the fear of hurting her, of using her. She leaned in and kissed him softly. "I want you," she whispered, "more than I have ever wanted anything." But then she paused. She pulled back just an inch. "But not like this," she said. "Not tonight. Not when Silas is in our heads. Not when we are angry and scared." Caleb closed his eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath. He nodded, resting his forehead against hers again. "You are right," he rasped. "I don't want it to be an escape. I want it to be us." They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other on the brink. Slowly, the frantic energy dissipated, replaced by a deep, quiet intimacy. They moved to the rug in front of the hearth. They didn't go to the separate beds. They lay down together, fully clothed, Caleb on his back. Ada curled into his side with her head on his chest. He wrapped his arm around her, his fingers entwining with hers. "We will figure this out," Caleb said into the darkness. Ada listened to the steady thump of his heart. She felt a new resolve hardening inside her. She was done hiding. She was done letting Silas Brand write her story. "We are not just going to pay him," Ada said quietly. Caleb squeezed her hand. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we stopped playing his game." She said, "He relies on secrets. He relies on shame. He corners me in alleys and threatens you in quiet corners because he knows we will keep quiet. He thinks we are ashamed." She sat up, looking down at Caleb. The firelight caught the steel in her eyes. "I am done being ashamed." "Caleb, what are you proposing?" he asked. "A town meeting," Ada said. "The church council meets on Thursday. Everyone goes. The store owners, the ranchers, the wives. Silas runs those meetings." Caleb said, "Exactly." Ada said, "And we are going to go, and we are going to tell them everything." "Everything?" Caleb asked. "Everything," Ada said. About the loan, about the threats, about what he said to me in the alley, about my father. It is a risk, Caleb said. They might not listen. They might run us out of town. They might, Ada admitted. But Silas thrives in the dark. Let's see how he does when we drag him into the light. Caleb looked at her. He reached up and touched her face. You are the bravest woman I have ever known, he said. Ada lay back down, resting her head on his shoulder. I am not brave, she whispered. I am just tired of running. She closed her eyes, her hand tight in his. Outside. The wind rattled the door, but inside, for the first time in a long time, there was no fear. Just two people, breathing in sync, waiting for the morning to start a war. The notice for the town meeting was posted on the church door on a Tuesday. It was ostensibly called to discuss grazing rights and water access in the lower valley, issues that affected every rancher from the foothills to the creek, but everyone knew what it really was. It was a coronation. Silas Brand intended to use the gathering to tighten his grip on the local holdings, forcing smaller operators to sign over water easements that would effectively strangle their independence. He expected submission. He expected silence. He did not expect Ada Lee. On the afternoon of the meeting, the sky was a pale, hard blue, stripped clean of clouds by a relentless wind. Before heading to the church, Ada rode the bay mare out to the edge of town, to a spot she had avoided for 6 years. The cottonwood tree stood alone near a bend in the dry creek bed. It was a massive, gnarled thing, its bark gray and deeply furrowed. In the summer, its leaves would shimmer like silver coins. But now, in the raw beginning of spring, it was bare and skeletal. Ada dismounted. Her boots crunched on the gravel as she walked toward the trunk. The ground beneath the heavy lower branch was bare dirt, worn smooth by wind and time. She reached out and touched the bark. About 7 feet up, there was a scar in the wood, a smooth, unnatural groove where a heavy rope had once bitten deep and held fast. She stood there for a long time. She could almost hear the jeering of the crowd from that day. She could see the dust rising as the wagon pulled away. She could feel the crushing, suffocating helplessness of being 16 and watching her world end. For years, this tree had been a monster in her mind. It had been the symbol of her shame, the proof that she came from bad blood. But as she stood there now, with the wind tearing at her bonnet, she realized the tree was just wood. It was just a thing that grew where a seed fell. It was not a judge. I am not him, she whispered to the empty air. And I am not who you say I am. She knelt in the dirt. She did not pray for forgiveness, for she had done nothing wrong. She did not pray for the town, for they did not deserve it. She simply let go. She released the grip of that terrible afternoon. She exhaled the ghost of the rustler's daughter. When she stood up, brushing the dust from her knees, her face was set. She was done living as a shadow. The church was packed. The pews were filled with ranchers in their Sunday suits, smelling of mothballs and tobacco. The women sat stiffly in their bonnets, whispering behind gloved hands. At the front, behind a heavy oak podium, stood Silas Brand. He looked impeccable. His suit was tailored, his linen crisp. He spoke with the easy, practiced cadence of a man who believes he is God's steward on earth. It is a matter of sound business, Silas was saying, his voice rolling over the crowd. We must centralize the water rights to ensure stability. The bank is willing to extend credit to those who cooperate, but we cannot afford the risk of unmanaged elements, irresponsible stewardship. He didn't look at Caleb, who sat near the back, but everyone knew who he meant. Heads nodded. Fear was a powerful motivator, and Silas held the mortgages on half the valley. Caleb sat rigid, his hat in his hands. He was ready to speak, to fight. But Ada placed a hand on his arm. No, she whispered. This part is mine. Ada stood up. The movement was small, but in the hushed church, it rippled like a stone dropped in a pond. Heads turned. Silas paused in mid-sentence, looking over his spectacles with a look of mild irritation that masked a deeper warning. Miss Lee, Silas said smoothly, We are in the middle of a business discussion. If you have a grievance about your laundry wages, perhaps you can wait until—" My father did not own a running iron. Ada's voice was not loud, but it was clear. It shook slightly, vibrating with the terrified beat of her heart. But she did not stop. The room went deadly silent. "Excuse me?" Silas said, his smile tightening. "You said he changed the brands on your cattle," Ada said, stepping out of the pew into the center aisle. "You said you saw him do it. You told the town he was a rustler. But my father did not own a running iron. He didn't even own a forge." She walked toward the front. She felt the eyes of the town on her, the same eyes that had watched her father hang, the same eyes that had looked away when she was mocked in the street. "You condemned him on your word alone," Ada said. "And because of your word, you got his land, just like you got the Miller place when Mr. Miller died, just like you are trying to get Caleb Hart's land now." Silas gripped the podium. "This is absurd. Sheriff, remove this woman. She is hysterical." Sheriff Brady shifted his weight against the back wall but made no move to step forward. "I am not hysterical," Ada said, stopping 10 feet from Silas. "I am a witness. I have watched you for 6 years. I have watched you use shame like a weapon. You call in debts when people are weak. You spread rumors to isolate them. You told the town my father was a criminal so you could take the creek access." Murmurs began to spread through the pews. Old-timers looked at each other, uncomfortable memories surfacing. They remembered the haste of that trial. They remembered how quickly Silas's fences had moved after the hanging. Mrs. Higgins, the widow Ada had worked for, stood up in the 3rd row. She leaned on her cane, her face stern. "She is right, Mrs. Higgins said, her voice cracking with age. "I knew John Lee. He was an honest man. I never believed those stories, but I was too afraid to say it." Silas's face turned a mottled red. "Sit down, Mrs. Higgins. You are confused." "I am not confused," the widow snapped. "I am ashamed." Caleb stood up then. He didn't walk to the front. He stood where he was, a towering figure in the back of the room. "And it is not just land," Caleb said. His voice was a low rumble that carried to the rafters. He looked directly at Silas. "He tried to buy me out," Caleb said. "He offered to forgive a portion of my debt, but there was a condition." Silas pointed a shaking finger at Caleb. "Be careful." "Hart, that is slander. He told me to get rid of Ada," Caleb continued, ignoring him. "He told me to put her in a mining camp. Or, he said, if she was willing to be grateful, he might extend the loan." A gasp went through the room. The women looked at Silas with horror. The men shifted, their faces darkening. In the West, you could kill a man over water, but to try and trade a woman's virtue for a debt was a sin that even a hard town couldn't swallow. Silas looked around the room. He saw the shift. He saw the fear turning to disgust. He saw his power, which relied on the illusion of respectability, cracking like thin ice. "You are all fools," Silas shouted, losing his composure. "I own this valley. I hold the paper on every one of you. If you listen to this trash, I will foreclose on every acre." He had said too much. The threat hung in the air, ugly and naked. One of the ranchers in the front row stood up. He looked at the petition Silas had been circulating. He picked it up, tore it in half, and let the pieces drift to the floor. "I reckon I will not be signing that," the rancher said. Silas stared at the paper on the floor. He looked at Ada, who was standing tall in the aisle, her hands clasped to stop their shaking. Pure, cold hatred filled his eyes. "This isn't over," he hissed at her. He stormed down the aisle, his hired men trailing behind him like dogs. The church doors slammed shut, leaving a ringing silence in his wake. Sheriff Brady walked to the front. He looked at Ada, then at the floor. "I will pull the files." "Miss Lee," the sheriff said quietly, "the old records. I will take a look." It was not an apology, but it was a start. The tension in the valley did not vanish. It curdled. For 3 days, Silas stayed on his ranch, and the town held its breath. On the 4th day, the sky turned the color of a bruise. Thunderheads piled up over the mountains, heavy and violent. Caleb was riding near the creek crossing, checking the herd. Ada was with him, insisting she would not stay behind at the cabin alone. They reached the crossing where the water ran shallow over the stones. The wind was whipping the sagebrush flat, and the first heavy drops of rain were hitting the dust like bullets. 3 riders appeared on the opposite bank. It was Silas and his 2 hired guns. They sat their horses, blocking the path. Caleb reined in. He put a hand out to stop Ada's horse. "Stay back," he murmured. Silas rode into the water. His horse, a nervous black stallion, tossed its head, fighting the bit. Silas looked wild. His clothes were disheveled, his eyes bloodshot. The humiliation at the church had broken something in him. "You think you won?" Silas shouted over the rising wind. "You think because a few old biddies cried in church that you can take what is mine? This is a public crossing." "Brand," Caleb said, his voice steady. "Let us pass." "It is my crossing," Silas screamed. "It is all mine." He pulled a heavy quirt from his saddle horn. "Get them," Silas ordered his men. "Run them off." The 2 hired guns hesitated. They looked at the sky, at the spooked cattle nearby, at the look of madness on their boss's face. "I said get them," Silas yelled, striking his own horse in his fury. The thunder cracked, a sound like the earth splitting open. At the same moment, a bolt of lightning grounded on the ridge above them. The world turned white. The herd of cattle grazing near the bank panicked in a blind terror. 50 head of steers surged forward, plunging down the embankment toward the water. The ground shook. It was chaos. Hooves, horns, and water churned into a frenzy. Silas's stallion reared, terrified by the thunder and the onrushing herd. Silas, caught off guard, lost his stirrup. He flailed, grabbing for the mane, but the horse twisted violently. Silas fell. He hit the shallow water and the rocks with a sickening crack. Before he could rise, the led steer hit him. Then another. "Silas!" Caleb shouted. He spurred his horse forward, not to fight, but to help. But it was impossible. The crossing was a churning mass of brown water and panicked beasts. The storm broke fully then, rain coming down in sheets that obscured the world. When the herd passed, scrambling up the far bank and disappearing into the gray curtain of rain, Caleb and Ada rode to the water's edge. Silas Brand lay tangled in the driftwood and stones. He was broken. His chest was crushed, his fine suit muddy and torn. He breathed once, a wet, rattling sound, and then his eyes stared up at the indifferent sky. Seeing nothing, the 2 hired men sat on their horses on the bank, pale and shaken. They had not drawn their guns. They had watched the land take back its own. Caleb looked at them. He kept his hands visible on his reins, away from his weapon. "You saw it!" Caleb shouted over the rain. "I never touched him. You saw it!" The older of the hired men looked at Silas's body, then at Caleb. He nodded slowly. "We saw it." "Heart," the man said. "The horse threw him. The herd did the rest." Caleb slumped in his saddle. He felt no triumph. He felt only a profound, shaking relief. He had refused to become a killer. He had refused to play Silas's game, and in the end, Silas had destroyed himself. The aftermath was a dismantling. With Silas dead, the sheriff finally felt free to do his job. He unlocked the safe in the bank's private office. What he found in Silas's papers was a map of corruption that spanned a decade. There were forged deeds, letters of blackmail, and records of bribes. Among them was a ledger detailing the acquisition of the Lee land. There was no proof of rustling, only a note about securing the creek access and a payment made to a drifter who had testified against Ada's father and then vanished. There was no ceremony, no parade, but the sheriff walked into the general store one morning and pinned a notice to the board. It stated that the judgment against John Lee had been reviewed and found to be without sufficient merit, and that the official record would reflect that he was innocent of the charge of rustling. It was a piece of paper. It could not bring a dead man back. But when Ada read it, she wept. She wept for the girl who had stood under the tree, and she wept because the stain was finally gone. Silas's estate was a mess of creditors and lawsuits. The ranch passed to his sister, a woman from St. Louis who had no love for the West and even less for her brother's schemes. She arrived in a carriage, took one look at the mud and the cows, and instructed the lawyers to settle everything as fast as possible. She called Caleb to the bank. She looked at the loan documents, then at Caleb's calloused hands. "My brother was a cruel man. Mr. Hart," she said, "I have no desire to continue his vendettas. If you can pay the interest, we will restructure the principal. 5 years?" Caleb signed the paper. The impossible debt was gone, replaced by a fair burden he could carry. He rode home with the deed in his saddlebag. When he walked into the cabin, Ada was at the stove, baking bread. The smell of yeast and wood smoke filled the room. "It is done," Caleb said. "The land is ours." He walked over to the table and laid the deed down. Beside it, he placed a second document he had the lawyer draw up. "What is this?" Ada asked, wiping her floury hands on her apron. Caleb looked at her. He took off his hat. "I told you I was not fighting for dirt," he said. "I was fighting for a home. And it is not my home, Ada. It is ours." He tapped the paper. "This transfers half the title to you, equal partners. If anything happens to me, nobody can put you out. You own the roof over your head." Ada stared at the paper. Ada Lee, joint owner. For a woman in the 1880s, property was rare. For a woman with her history, it was a miracle. "You do not have to do this," she whispered. "I want to," Caleb said. "I want your name beside mine. Everywhere it matters." Ada picked up the pen. Her hands shook, but not from fear. She signed her name. The ink was black and permanent. She belonged here, not as a guest, not as a housekeeper, but as an owner. Spring turned into summer. The land, watered by the violent storms, healed. The grass grew thick and green, hiding the scars of the winter. The cattle fattened, their coats turning sleek. Ada planted her garden near the creek. She put in potatoes, peas, and rows of hardy beans. She worked the soil with her bare hands, feeling the warmth of the earth. When the first green shoots pushed through the dirt, curling toward the sun, she felt a profound sense of kinship. They had both survived the frost. Their love settled into the rhythm of the days. It was not a dramatic, stormy thing anymore. It was woven into the fabric of their survival. It was in the shared coffee before dawn, the laughter over a loaf of bread that burned because they were distracted by a kiss, the quiet moments in the evening when Caleb would read aloud from a newspaper and Ada would rest her feet in his lap. They were lovers, partners, and friends. The fierce, hungry affection they shared in the dark was no one's business but their own, a private fire that kept the rest of the world at bay. In late August, the town held another social. It was in the same church hall. The same fiddle player was there. The same smell of sawdust and coffee filled the air. Ada stood before the small mirror in the cabin. She was wearing a new dress. She had sewn it herself, not from the cheap muslin, but from a bolt of blue cotton Caleb had brought her, the color of the summer sky. It was simple, without lace or frills, but she had cut it to fit her own form, knowing her own worth. She smoothed the skirt. She looked at her reflection. She didn't see a victim. She saw a woman who had walked through fire and come out holding gold. "Ready?" Caleb asked from the doorway. He was wearing a clean shirt and a new vest. He looked handsome, the lines of worry around his eyes smoothed away by months of peace. "Ready?" Ada said. They rode into town in the wagon. They didn't sneak in. They walked up the main street, arm in arm. When they entered the hall, the music didn't stop, but heads turned. Old habits died hard in Dry Creek. A few women near the punch bowl looked at Ada, their eyes narrowing, ready to sneer, ready to whisper about the rustler's daughter. But then they saw her head held high. They saw the way Caleb walked beside her, not protectively, but proudly. They saw the deed to the land in the way she carried herself. Caleb felt the eyes. He stopped near the center of the room. He didn't make a speech. He didn't challenge anyone to a fight. He simply looked at the woman on his arm. He leaned down, just loud enough for the people nearby to hear. "You look beautiful, Ada," he said. "Thank you." She smiled. He looked around the room, meeting the gazes of the people who had once mocked her. His look was calm, settled. "She is the finest woman here," he said. It was the same line, but this time, There was no laughter. There were no scoffs. The banker's wife nodded politely. The store clerk tipped his hat. The space around them shifted, opening up, accepting them. Caleb held out his hand. "May I?" Ada placed her hand in his. They stepped onto the floor. The fiddler played a waltz. Slow and sweet. They danced, boots on worn boards. Her cheek rested against his chest. His hand was steady at her waist. They moved together, two scarred souls who had refused to let the world decide their worth. They held tight to each other, a love that had survived dust, hunger, cruelty, and the wild, unforgiving beauty of the western land. And outside, under the vast canopy of stars, the wind blew softly through the cottonwoods, no longer whispering of death, but singing of home. Thank you for listening to this story of Ada and Caleb. It has been a journey through the dust and snow of the high plains, and I hope their fight for dignity and love resonated with you. I would love to know where you are listening from. Please leave a comment below and share your location and your thoughts on the ending. Did Silas get what he deserved? If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of the American frontier. Until next time, keep your fences mended and your powder dry,